Hey guys, this is Nirpam from the Underwater Photography Guide and Bluewater Photo. Now I'm here today with the Nikon Z8. This is the most anticipated camera from Nikon in years. It's the upgrade everyone's been waiting for from their DSLRs. So I thought I would do a full settings video on how to take photos with the Nikon Z8 and what my underwater settings are with the camera. Now I'll do a brief overview of the body and then I'm going to go right into the settings. This is going to be a long video and I'll have an Atomos Ninja 5 right here to record the internals of the camera while I go through the underwater settings, so you'll be able to see exactly what I'm doing. I'm going to try to do this all in one go, which means it could be a little dense, it might not be perfect, but it's what I need to do in order to get through this camera. So with that, let's go over the camera. Now if you take a look at the camera, and let's see if I can position this nicely. So I'm actually filming with this with the Nikon Z6. But anyway, this is the Nikon Z8. So I like to use the back panel quite a bit when I'm shooting underwater. If you shoot a Nikon, this might look pretty familiar to you. It's pretty intuitive and easy to use, and I love the ergonomics on the camera. Now, my favorite button to use is the I button right here. This pulls up my main menu with settings that I preset for underwater filming, and I'll show you guys how to do that. So I often will go through and I'll adjust my ISO like that, and I'll move through the camera with my I menu mostly. Another cool switch on the Nikon is the photo to video mode switch. This is was exclusive to Nikon until Sony came out with that. But I really like being able to switch so easily from photo to video, and your settings are going to be entirely different whether you're shooting photo or video. Another cool button on this camera is right here. This is the magnified viewfinder switch, so you can switch between your monitor and the magnified viewfinder, which makes it really easy underwater, so you don't need to do a custom setting for that. There's not as many custom buttons on the Z8 as are on Sony cameras or Canon cameras, but there's a good number. Now in order to adjust your ISO and shutter speed, you use a back dial here and then a front dial on the camera like so. This is the lens release button, and to adjust your mode, drive mode, or anything like that, you use these 4 buttons on the top. It's kind of reminiscent of the DSLR days. What I don't really like about the camera is you do have to touch the drive mode button and use a dial to adjust, which is easy above water, not as much underwater. So try to set your drive mode and your mode early before you actually get in the water. Now with that, I'm going to get into how to use this camera and all the underwater settings as I hook up my Atomos Ninja 5. So let's get started. Start with the drive button. You can use the drive mode on the top right left button here and flip through to go between your low, high, 30 frames per second and 60 frames per second drive. And then you can also adjust the frames per second. So I like to keep it on 5 frames per second in my L mode. Now if you want to adjust your mode of the camera itself, you press the mode button, and again you flip through with the dial on the back of the camera. Now if you want to adjust your white balance, again you can go through different white balance settings by hitting your white balance button and using the dial to go through those settings. I like to keep mine on auto when I'm shooting underwater. Now in the I menu, these are my default settings that I like to have for photography. Now, you know, these can be different for everybody, but this is just what I find to be the best and quickest to use while I'm shooting underwater. And in fact, some of these settings I don't even need to use. Like, I would probably switch this one out with white balance or something else that I use more regularly. So I can go through real quick and say that in my I menu, I like to have ISO, white balance, the view mode. So this allows you to turn off your live view settings, and what that means is when you're taking a photo underwater and you have strobes, you want everything to be the same brightness whether or not you're changing your settings. If you're above water, you want your settings to affect the brightness in the screen so you know what photo you're going to get. So I'm above water now, I can put my live view settings on, and now when I shoot you can see that it's dark because the settings are being applied to the image. This is great for shooting topside, but underwater I turn that off with strobes so I can see what I'm doing. This is a super important setting underwater, so don't forget about the live view setting, and I'll show you guys how to customize your I menu so you can have that in there. Autofocus tracking, I turn that on, and I expect my subjects to be erratic. So that's kind of where I keep my autofocus tracking settings. But if your subjects are steady, you could also adjust it so it says steady. And that could be something like an anemone or coral. When it comes to subject detection and the autofocus area modes, I like to keep mine on 3D. But then you can also have single point if you're doing macro, and sometimes these other settings are useful as well. But 3D for me has always been the most accurate because you can press your AF on button on the back of the screen and it'll lock on. It's kind of having trouble because there's not really any. There we go. Let's get it to lock on. So it'll lock on to your subject in the background, and then you can move your camera around and the autofocus point is going to try to follow that. The lighting conditions in here are not great and there's not much contrast, so you really want a high contrast scene if you're going to lock onto a subject underwater. But it does a pretty decent job. So I like the 3D tracking mode, but if you want to get a little bit wider because you have sharks or rays or something moving really fast, the wide area mode does pretty well, and it still tracks pretty well by holding the AF on button. And then you can also go through and go to your single autofocus box if you like to do a lot of macro shooting. Now that's your autofocus area mode, but if you want to actually lock your autofocus point, you're going to need to go to your focus mode. Again, I recommend having this in the eye menu, and you want to go and click autofocus single, or if you want to lock it on, and autofocus continuous if you want your camera to keep tracking and focusing underwater the whole time. So what I like to do for macros, I like to use autofocus single and lock onto a single spot, and it goes very quickly, especially if your subject is not moving that often. If your subject is moving a lot, then I go to autofocus continuous, and then I'll change the autofocus area mode to 3D, as I said before. And then you can also see that I had my autofocus subject detection as animal, or you could set it to people if you're taking photos above water, but I like to keep it on animal. And now I can track a subject that's moving around a lot. So you can see the autofocus box moves quite a bit. I use this setting for macro as well, but it is a little bit better for wide angle, and if things aren't moving around, I use single spot. As I said, there are other area modes, so you could use a large autofocus area mode if you know that your subject's pretty big and all you need is the box to be somewhat around it. But overall, like I said, 3D tracking is my favorite. If you want to switch to manual focus, you can also switch to manual focus in your focus mode. So again, that's focus mode and that's area mode. Finally, this is the tracking settings, and this is a special custom setting I put in my eye menu so that I could affect the tracking sensitivity. If your subject's really erratic, you want to make it erratic, and you want to also be able to set how quickly your camera will respond if a subject blocks another subject blocks your actual subject. Going through the rest of the eye menu, you can set which card is taking your data, and I have a CF Express card in here. You can also add an SD card in the Z8 as well. I have battery info right here, but I'll probably change this out later on because I don't think it's very useful. You can have a quick menu that actually goes to your custom settings. So if you want to quickly change a button, you can set your your eye menu to have custom controls for your shooting mode. And now I can actually go quickly and set my custom buttons if I really want to. That's a bit of a dangerous setting to have because you can accidentally knock something. Flash mode, I always keep that in there, and I keep it on fill flash for underwater strobes. You can also use rear curtain sync if you want to get motion blur behind your subject if you're doing slow shutter motion blur photography, or you can turn your flash off right here. But generally I use fill flash and it works great for TTL as well. For vibration reduction, I keep that on or sport. Depends on how much you're moving underwater, but that will help reduce motion blur from inside the camera if you're shooting at slow shutters, because it's going to affect your in-body image stabilization. Metering mode, I like to keep that on spot for TTL, although I've been playing with center weighted as well, and trying to determine if spot, highlighted, or center weighted is the best for TTL. I do find that spot works pretty well overall though. And generally, if your metering will also affect your other settings, not just TTL on strobes. It'll affect automatic settings like shutter speed or aperture if you're in shutter speed priority or aperture priority. So you might need to change that depending on the lighting conditions if you're shooting into the sun or anything like that. Now, moving on with the camera, let's go into the menu. The menu, unfortunately, is very extensive and it's very difficult to navigate compared to Sony or Canon camera. That said, I mean, Nikon menus are generally pretty decent, but it just takes a little bit of remembering where your settings are in this menu. The menu is organized so that you have your photo menu, your video menu, and then your custom setting menu. And I go through my custom settings usually once in a lifetime of shooting the camera. I set them once, I'll do that here today. And then I also will more regularly go through the photo and video shooting menu. Finally, you have your playback menu. Again, you don't really need to touch too much in here. And then you have your setup menu where you'll be formatting your card, checking your battery life, everything like that. You have your connectivity menu and then your My Menu settings where you can add quick menu items and get there very quickly. So if we start with the photo shooting menu, you can set your photo banks here. And what a photo bank is it's a custom, it's all the settings that you're currently using. You can save it and create a custom setting so that you can quickly go back there. So if you want to shoot macro or you want to shoot wide angle, you can create a photo bank and you can go ahead and add it to a bank so that you can recall it later very quickly. But I don't usually use this. I prefer to actually change my settings underwater as shooting situations change. I think it's the best way to learn underwater photography. You can, I believe this setting allows you to use more banks. Again, I don't usually use them anyway. Oops, sorry about that. So I typically don't, I typically keep that off. You can change the name of the files or where they're stored. I keep it on the default setting. I was shooting with a CF Express card, so that's my primary slot. I don't have a secondary slot, but you can choose if you want to add JPEGs or RAW photos to your secondary slot here. Tone mode, I typically recommend standard tones because you can edit a lot of that in Lightroom. Image quality, I keep on RAW. You have the option to use HEIF files, JPEG files. You can do RAW and JPEG, but I typically shoot RAW. The files are 45.7 megapixels, they're big, so you want to keep it as streamlined as you can without losing quality. I keep my RAW files as high quality as they possibly can be. I don't use lossless compression because you will lose quality. You can also use high efficiency, but for me, I like using this middle setting here. Now for ISO, I will change my ISO when I'm shooting underwater in the I menu, right? So I'll just flip left and right when I change my ISO. If you need it to go to auto ISO, you click the down arrow and then you move your setting over here to auto ISO. However, I like to keep it on manual ISO. So again, that is in the I menu. Now in the menu, I don't mess with the ISO setting, I don't mess with white balance, I can do all of that in the I menu. Picture control, I put it on vivid, but again, that's for JPEGs, so it's not a huge deal because I'm shooting it in RAW. For color space, I keep that on sRGB unless you're really into printing and know what you're doing. Keep it on sRGB. Adobe RGB is mostly for printing. I keep active delighting off, long exposure noise reduction off, high ISO noise reduction off, vignetting control on normal. And the reason I keep all of these off is because, again, you can adjust this all in Lightroom. Diffraction compensation, I do keep on. Auto distortion control, I keep on. Skin softening off. A lot of these are going to be your default settings. High flicker reduction off, photo flicker reduction off. Metering mode spot, like I said, I change that in the I menu. Flash mode is on fill-in, again in the I menu. Focus modes, I change in the I menu. So a lot of this menu here you can get to much quicker by just pressing the I menu and having it right there on your fingertips. You can set time lapses here. I'm not going to go into that because that's not an underwater setting, but it's easy to do in the camera in your time lapse menu under your shooting menu. And I don't use focus shift underwater. Again, that's something that you would do mostly above water. Now if we go into the video recording mode, again you can have a shooting bank for underwater video. Now, a lot of these settings are similar to your photo mode. You can decide where you're going to store your video. Maybe you store your video on your CF Express card and your RAW files on your SD card. You can choose your bit rate and codec in your video mode right here under video file type. So if I select video file type, I typically will shoot H.265 8-bit unless I'm shooting in a log profile or a RAW profile, in which case I'll start moving up to H.265 10-bit, ProRes RAW, and you can actually shoot in NRAW as well, which is 12-bit RAW. So if you're into RAW recording and you know how to edit that and you know what the file size implications are, go for it. Otherwise, the files will be way too big. It's very difficult to edit for somebody who doesn't know how to edit RAW. So I recommend watching some videos and learning how to edit RAW before you get into that space. Otherwise, you can do H.264 or H.265 8-bit recording and you should be okay. Now, typically I like to shoot 4K video up to 60 frames per second. So I like to choose this H.265 8-bit 4K 60 frames, and that allows me to shoot at a high frame rate, so I can slow my footage down for better stabilization, and at a large resolution, so I can crop it down if I need to and I want to export in 1080. Now you can also shoot 8K video up to 30 frames per second, and you can actually shoot 8K up to 60 frames per second if you're using the right bitrate. Now, I don't do that often, I don't recommend it, but if you do want to do some major cropping and you're okay using a lot of space, you can shoot in 8K video, and if you don't have a tripod, 8K 60 is going to be your best bet. But again, you're going to need to use a higher bitrate for that. Video quality, I keep it on high quality NRAW. That's if you're going to use NRAW. I'm not using NRAW in most cases, but I keep it there in case I am. Image area, I like to use the full frame image area, but you can also crop your video and shoot in a crop sensor mode, and you can see I keep extended oversampling off, but that allows you to, and if you're ever wondering what something does, you can press the question mark button, but that allows you to downsample your video, which also improves video quality, but it can drain your battery life. So I keep that off, but if you want the highest quality video possible, you can keep extended oversampling on. ISO, again, I change that in camera using the I menu. You could set a dial for video to change your ISO because that's going to be the setting that you're going to be adjusting the most. White balance, picture control, all these other settings, active delighting, high reduction, or high ISO noise reduction, those are all for the most part going to be accessible in your I menu. I'd say active or high ISO noise reduction I do keep on for video because these are JPEG files with each frame. They're not actual RAW files. So having the noise reduction actually will help your video quality, vignette control, and all of these I also keep on. So going through this. Metering for video, I typically like to leave that on matrix metering. Now if you are using a video light, you might want to use center weighted or highlight weighted. For the focus mode, I like to keep that on AF full time, and I just find that to be a little more cinematic, a little bit nicer for focusing, unless you're using a tripod or you want to lock the focus, in which case autofocus single will allow you to quickly lock the focus on the subject, start filming without having your focus move at all, which can be distracting at times. For the autofocus area mode for video, I like to generally shoot wide. Nice thing is you can also use subject tracking autofocus when you are filming video, and that's a pretty cool setting to have too, so you can actually track your subjects while you're shooting video. Vibration reduction, I leave that on sport or normal. Sport's just a little bit more intense if you're moving around a lot, which underwater it is a sport. So I leave it on sport and I'll get better vibration reduction or IBIS that way. Exposure or electronic vibration reduction, I leave that off because you sometimes get a warpy look, but you can leave that on if you are in a really, really difficult environment to shoot in, like waves and that kind of thing as well. Microphone sensitivity, you can adjust your microphone manually, and I will sometimes bring my levels down so that I can use it with a shotgun mic. Again, this is for more topside shooting. You're usually not going to use your underwater microphone unless you have a hydrophone like we sell from Mirrorless. The attenuator, I keep that off. Wind noise reduction, I keep it off. Mic jack, plug-in power, again, all of these I keep on the default setting for the most part. And that brings us to our custom menu. So here you can set which custom shooting bank you're going to be using. But underneath that, this allows you to get a little bit more into your settings. And again, I use my custom settings menu once, twice, 3 times during the life cycle of the camera because I set it and I'm done. So I'm going to walk you through what settings I like to choose. A lot of these are also going to be default, but they work quite well for the situation. So autofocus continuous priority selection, this is when your focus mode is an autofocus continuous mode. You want to keep this on release. This is the default setting, and what that means is when you're shooting, regardless of if the subject is in focus or not, it's going to take the photo. With autofocus continuous, your focus is moving so quickly, you want to just have it take the photo no matter what, and a lot of your frames will come out. Now autofocus single, you're going to be shooting a little bit slower, so if your autofocus point is in focus, that's when you want it to take the photo, so I put that in focus. This is those autofocus tracking settings that I mentioned, that if you have another subject come in front of your camera and block your focus point, what happens then? You can set it to look for erratic subjects, steady subjects, and how quickly do you want to delay that autofocus box moving between subjects. Now again, like I said, I set that in the eye menu so I can reach that quickly. The focus point used, you can use, this can be default. Store points by orientation, I keep that off. AF activation, I keep that on. Focus point persistence, I keep that on auto. Again, a lot of these are the default settings. Wraparound focus points, I keep that off. Focus mode restrictions, I don't have any restrictions. Focus point display, you can change what color your focus point is going to be and what that display looks like. I just keep that on the default mode, but if you want to change the color, sometimes you can do red. I like seeing the white underwater. I turn off the built-in autofocus illuminator. Your camera's in a housing, you don't need that on. So go ahead and keep that off because it's just going to waste battery. Focus peaking, I keep that on so that when you're shooting in manual mode, for instance here, if I go to manual mode, for your focus, you can adjust your focus point, and you can see it's a little bit hard to see in this screen, but there's going to be a red outline over what's in focus. That's peaking, so you can actually see what part of your image is going to be in focus. So that's very useful for manual focus. So if I go back again, in your focus settings, that's focus peaking. Go ahead and turn that on, and you can adjust the highlight color and also how sensitive it is. I like high sensitivity, so I'm going to keep that there. Okay, back to focus. Focus point selection speed is normal. Manual focus ring and on AF mode, keep that on. That allows you to do a quick manual adjustment when you are shooting. Oops, sorry, I keep that on. So that allows you to do a manual focus adjustment while you are shooting it in an autofocus setting. When it comes to your metering and exposure menu, I keep all of this on default for the most part. I find that the default settings work quite well, and I haven't really needed to change my metering except in the eye menu of my camera. When it comes to timers, you don't really use timers underwater, but this allows you to set a timer if you want to take photos. And what it allows you to do is set a timer, but also how many shots you want to take when the shutter goes off, and what the interval should be between the shots. But typically I only keep that on 1 if I am using the timer. But it's really nice for waterfalls. If you want to shoot multiple shots after your timer goes off for 10 seconds, you can go ahead and increase the number of shots. So going back here, if we go to our shooting display menu, again, I keep a lot of these settings on default. Continuous shooting speed, maximum shots per burst, pre-release capture options, extended shutter speeds, all of this I keep on default. The one setting that you want to make sure you have is you don't want to show the effects of settings for live view. You want to adjust for ease of viewing when you are shooting with strobes. So you want to turn your live view basically off when you're shooting with strobes and on when you're shooting above water without strobe. So this would be above water here, or you can use this for underwater. Starlight view I turned off, warm display colors off, LCD illumination off, and the image frame, grid type, virtual horizon type, custom monitor shooting display, all of these settings can be on default. Now, when we go through bracketing in Flash, I use the default Flash settings. It will work well with TTL. And I don't really have too much to say about Flash. You want to use fill-in Flash like I said before. Again, I adjust that in the I menu. But if you guys find that for whatever reason you like using different Flash settings or something works better in any of the settings that I'm talking to you about, make sure you drop a comment below and say what kind of settings you like to use, or if I'm saying something that doesn't quite make sense. Again, I've had this camera for a few weeks now, so I haven't gone 100% through the menu system and dealt with every little setting in minute detail. What I'm trying to do is show you guys the quick way that I would shoot underwater. Alright, so now this is the most important setting here. Under your controls menu, you can adjust your buttons, set custom buttons, and adjust your eye menu. So if I go into the eye menu right now, this allows me to, and again, I want to reiterate that. So I go to controls, F1, customize eye menu, I click the right button. Now I'm in the customization menu for your eye menu. So like I said, I like to have ISO, white balance, live view, AF on tracking, the subject selection and area mode, the focus mode, the memory card info. I'm gonna actually change this battery, this battery mode to something else. So if you click OK, now you can change your setting in the eye menu, and you have all these options here that you can go through. So what I usually like to do when I'm going through options is I'll just go through each setting in the eye menu and decide, is this something that would be useful for me in my day-to-day shooting? So going through this menu, I can see that overall, a lot of this is not very useful, which is why there's enough options in the eye menu for you to get through all of the items that you need for your day-to-day shooting and still have some left over. This is one of my leftover settings, but I think what I'm going to choose here is probably interval timer shooting for when I'm doing waterfalls and things with topside, not underwater. You can do silent mode as well to turn off all the sound coming from the camera. Typically I like to make sure that the camera is silent when I'm shooting. So yeah, let's move this over to interval timer shooting. So now when I'm shooting in my eye menu, I can decide if I want to do time lapse or anything like that. Okay, so going back to that eye menu customization, I have to go to controls, customize eye menu, and now you can go through and set it how you want to, but I typically recommend setting it exactly as I have here for underwater. So again, there's metering, vibration reduction, flash, custom controls, and I went through the other settings before. Okay, going back to the menu system. Under custom controls for shooting, this is where you can set any of the buttons that you might want to customize on your camera and on your lens as well. So it'll highlight to tell you which button to set. So the FN3 button, for instance, I don't think picture control is very useful. So you can go through, and if you go, again, you go into your menu, go to controls, hit custom control shooting, and now I've highlighted this button, I click OK. It brings me to a menu where I can actually go through and maybe pick a more useful setting for my day-to-day shooting. So there's not too much that you might want to do while shooting underwater. I think a lot of it, again, can be accessed from the eye menu. But let's say I want to adjust my drive mode, or yeah, let's set the drive mode here. So under if I press the FN3 button now, I can adjust the drive mode. However, it's not very different from pressing the drive button here. So I don't think that the Z8 is super great when it comes to customizations. there's not many options that you don't already have to use, or, that you're not already using, but you can always find just a little bit more that you can do with these extra buttons. Overall, I think because the ergonomics are so streamlined, you just really don't need a lot of this stuff. Set picture control is fine. ISO could be another good one. So you can have a quick ISO button like the FN3 button, and now you can adjust your ISO very quickly. Or you can do it in your iMenu, as I do. So now that we've gone through customizing our custom controls in the photo menu, you can do the same thing in the video menu. All you have to do is go to Customize iMenu under your video mode, or also, let's see, Customize Control, just the next setting down. Under Customize iMenu in the video mode, I like to have my iMenu with picture control, white balance, frame rate, frame size that allows you to set your frame rate and resolution, your microphone sensitivity. Typically I'll even bring that down a little bit like I said before. Autofocus area mode, subject detection, autofocus mode, where you want your video files to live, zebra patterns, which allow you to look at how much your video is being overexposed, so you can actually set your zebra settings and how sensitive that is as well. Any shooting menu banks if you want to have custom settings on there, a quick menu for custom control. I like to have vibration reduction, and finally electronic vibration reduction if it gets very wavy or anything like that underwater. So going back to the menu, the same thing goes for custom controls. You can set different buttons on the camera to be different from those buttons that you're also using in the photo menu. So if you want your FN3 button to be different in video mode than photo mode, you can do that, and you can customize that in your G2 menu right there. So one important setting that I really want to talk about is your playback menu. So what happens when you actually take a photo? One thing that is important to know is under timers, and I missed this a little bit before, but if you go to timers and you go to self timer or power off delay, that'll set the amount of time when your camera powers off. If you're just putting it on standby, which I put as 30 seconds, if you're in your menus, which I put as 1 minute, and then if you're looking at picture review, I put that at 2 seconds. That allows me to basically take a photo. The photo is viewed back at 2 seconds. I don't usually do 4 seconds or 10 seconds because I'm in a rush underwater, but what I noticed with the Z8 is when you take a photo, because it's in silent mode, it's very hard to know that that photo was taken. So I always try to have my picture review at 2 seconds. So again, that's under C3 under your timers menu. That's one thing I forgot to mention, and I just wanted to bring that up now. For video mode, going through some of the other video settings, you can set your autofocus speed. I usually leave that a little bit faster for quick subjects underwater. And then you can also set your tracking sensitivity. I usually use that pretty high, again, because things move pretty fast underwater. And then you can set your zebra patterns, so you can set what's your threshold for the highlights, what the pattern looks like, and that will help you determine, okay, what is overexposed for the kind of video that I'm shooting. You can set your grid type in the video mode as well. And then you can have your monitor settings over here. Now, G18 is actually pretty important. This makes you have a red frame around your video, basically like a tally light when you're recording. I use that quite a bit because it really helps me know when I'm recording, so I keep that on. So red recording frame indicator, I keep that on. Going through the rest of the menu, because that basically concludes our custom menu settings, let's jump down to our playback menu. I keep most of the playback menu on default. So for underwater purposes, the one thing that you could change would be auto rotation. So if you don't want your screen to auto rotate, you can turn that off. And finally, under setup menu, this is a pretty important menu. This is where you go ahead and format your memory card, as you can see here. So to format the memory card, you just choose which card you want to format. You can adjust your monitor brightness. I leave that on default as 0. Color balance, viewfinder brightness, some of the displays. A lot of these I'll also leave on default. You can clean your image sensor if you have a little bit of dust on the sensor. Doesn't work super well, but it will keep some of the dust off. So I recommend doing that every now and then. You can adjust your camera sounds. So I like to leave the shutter sound off. And that just makes it a little bit less annoying. When you're shooting underwater, you're not even going to hear it anyway. And then the rest of the settings I just leave on default. Another option here is battery info. It's really useful because you get a detailed percentage for the battery life. And then energy saving mode, if you really want to put it on energy saving mode, I don't really recommend it. You can get through 4 dives on one battery fairly easily. If you want to do a firmware update and check your firmware, you can do that under firmware version. Now for connectivity settings, I typically leave that under default, and I'll put it in airplane mode. That means my camera's not going to try to connect anywhere else, and it won't have the risk of losing battery life. My menu, I usually leave that blank. By the time I've set up everything else, I'm usually pretty good. So hopefully that was a good enough overview to get you guys shooting underwater. I'll have a written settings review in the description below as well. If you have any questions or you think that you have better settings or other settings that you recommend, please drop them in the comments below. This is meant to be kind of a collaborative space where we can discuss what works for you underwater. Again, I took this camera diving for a few weeks, but that's not enough time, as it will be a few years from now when everybody knows what to do underwater. So with that, if you like this video, make sure you like it, because it really helps us get the content out there, and we'll get more camera review videos up for you guys. And subscribe to see more content, tutorials, reviews, and all that good stuff on our channel. So with that, I hope these settings help you out.